Athens, the cradle of democracy, philosophy, and art. But behind its marble walls lay a hidden truth. Children sold for debts, bodies broken in mines, lives erased from history. This is not the Greece you learned about in school. This is the story of one boy and the wooden horse he carried, whose life reveals the terrible price of civilization's glory. The sun hung low over the parched fields, casting long shadows across the cracked earth where Lysander's family had spent generations coaxing life from the stubborn soil. The boy stood silent beside his father, his bare feet pressing into the dust as the wind carried the scent of dry barley and desperation. A merchant's sandals crunched against the ground as he approached, his robes too fine for the dirt of a farmer's plot, his rings glinting in the fading light. Lysander's father bowed his head, his calloused hands clenched at his sides. The words exchanged were quiet, measured, but the weight of them settled like stones in the boy's stomach. He didn't need to hear the numbers to understand. The debt had grown too large, the harvest too meager. His mother stood a few paces behind, her face streaked with silent tears, her fingers twisting the frayed edge of her tunic, as if she could weave a different fate from the threads. The merchant's gaze flickered to Lysander, assessing, calculating. The boy stiffened under the scrutiny, his throat tightening as the realization crept over him. He was not a son in that moment, not a child. He was a weight to be lifted, a debt to be settled. His father's hand, rough and trembling, rested briefly on his shoulder before withdrawing. The touch was apology and farewell in one. His mother rushed forward then, pressing a small wooden horse into his hands, a toy carved by his father in better days, its edges worn smooth from years of play. She clutched him tightly, her breath hot against his ear, whispering words he would cling to in the nights to come. Then she was pulled away, her sobs tearing through the stillness as the merchant's men led Lysander from the only home he had ever known. The last thing he saw was his father's bowed back, his mother's outstretched hand, and the field stretching endlessly behind them, golden in the dying light. The wooden horse dug into his palm as he walked, its shape a fragile promise of something he could not name. The road ahead was long, and the chains were cold, but the debt had been paid. The iron shackles bit into Lysander's wrists as the line of captives trudged forward, their footsteps stirring dust that clung to their skin like a second layer of misery. The sun blazed overhead, relentless, turning the road into a ribbon of shimmering heat. Behind them, the familiar hills of his homeland had long since vanished, swallowed by the horizon. Ahead lay only the unknown, Athens, a city of marble and whispers, where men spoke of justice while others labored in chains. Lysander stumbled, his legs unsteady from exhaustion and hunger. The guards barked orders, their voices sharp as whips, and the column lurched forward again. The boy clutched the wooden horse hidden beneath his tunic, its smooth edges a fragile tether to the life he had lost. Around him, the other captives moved in silence, their faces hollowed by fatigue, their eyes dull with resignation. Then came a rasping voice from beside him, low and steady. "Keep your head down, boy. The road is long, and they have no patience for weakness." Lysander turned to see an older man, his beard streaked with gray, his shoulders bowed but not yet broken. Theron, he would learn his name, was a man who had once been free, who had once had a family, a trade, a life. Now, like Lysander, he was property. Theron's words were sparse but deliberate, each one carrying the weight of hard-earned knowledge. He spoke of the city that awaited them, of masters who wielded philosophy like a blade, cutting down those beneath them with one hand while penning treatises on virtue with the other. He warned of the mines, the kitchens, the endless toil that wore men to shadows before discarding them. The days blurred together, thin rations of stale bread and brackish water, nights spent huddled on the hard ground, the ever-present clink of chains. Lysander's feet grew raw, his skin burned beneath the sun. But Theron's presence was a small mercy, a flicker of warmth in the cold march toward servitude. One evening, as the guards drank and laughed around their fire, Theron leaned closer. "Remember this boy," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "They can take your freedom, your body, even your name. But what's here?" He tapped his temple. "That's yours. Keep it sharp. Keep it hidden." Lysander nodded, the words settling deep inside him like seeds in barren soil. He did not yet know if they would grow, but he clung to them all the same. The road stretched on endless, but with each step, the boy he had been fated, replaced by something harder, something survival demanded. The wooden horse pressed against his ribs, a silent reminder of a world that no longer existed. Athens rose from the horizon like a dream carved in stone, its white columns and sprawling agora gleaming under the midday sun. The city breathed with the clamor of merchants, the murmur of philosophers, the rhythmic clang of blacksmiths, a world alive with the illusion of freedom. Lysander, still bound in chains, saw none of its grandeur. To him, Athens was a beast with marble teeth, ready to swallow him whole. The slavers herded their captives through the city gates, past market stalls overflowing with figs and olives, past laughing children who barely glanced at the chained procession. The scent of roasting meat made Lysander's stomach twist with hunger, but there was no pause, no mercy. The auction block awaited. He searched for Theron in the shuffling crowd, but the old man had been pulled away earlier, sold to a buyer whose face Lysander never saw. The absence left him hollow, as if the last tether to his old life had snapped. Now he stood alone, sweat trickling down his back, as the auctioneer's voice boomed over the gathered crowd. A hand grabbed his arm, wrenching him forward. The auctioneer's fingers dug into his chin, tilting his face toward the light. "Strong limbs, good teeth," the man declared, as if assessing livestock. The crowd murmured, eyes calculating. Then came the clink of coins, the finality of a deal struck. Lysander was shoved toward a man in a finely woven chiton, Demetrius, a philosopher whose name dripped with respect in the city's halls. Demetrius did not look at Lysander as he led him away, speaking instead to a companion about justice, about the harmony of the polis. His words were honeyed, polished, but his grip on Lysander's chain was iron. The philosopher's home was a sprawling villa, its walls adorned with frescoes of gods and heroes, its courtyard shaded by olive trees. Yet the beauty was a mask. The moment the gates closed behind them, Demetrius's demeanor shifted. His veneer of civility cracked, revealing the disdain beneath. He snapped his fingers at a servant, barely glancing at Lysander as he ordered, "Put this one in the kitchen. Let him earn his keep." The kitchen was a world of heat and toil. Great fires roared beneath bronze pots, their flames licking at the sweat-slicked faces of the slaves who tended them. The air was thick with the scent of garlic and burning oil. The clatter of knives against would a constant rhythm. Lysander was handed a mortar and pestle, his task to grind spices until his arms trembled. That was where he met Elpis. She moved through the chaos like a shadow, her hands quick, her eyes sharper. A woman of few words, she took one look at Lysander's blistered palms and shoved a damp cloth into them without ceremony. "Press this to your skin," she muttered, barely pausing in her work. "The blisters will harden soon enough." Elpis had been in the household for years, long enough to know its secrets. She showed Lysander how to steal scraps without being caught, how to feign obedience while keeping his thoughts his own. She taught him which overseers were cruel, which could be bribed with a flattering word. Most importantly, she warned him of Demetrius, the man who preached virtue to the masses but struck his slaves for spilling wine. At night, when the kitchen fires dimmed to embers, Lysander curled on a thin pallet, the wooden horse hidden beneath his tunic. He thought of Theron's warnings, of Elpis's lessons, of the way Demetrius's voice had dripped with righteousness while his hands dealt in suffering. Athens was not a city of light, he realized. It was a city built on shadows, and he was now one of them. The symposium was in full swing, the air thick with the scent of spiced wine and roasted meats. Laughter and debate swirled through the andron, the men reclining on cushioned couches like gods at a feast. Lysander stood motionless against the wall, a pitcher of wine in his hands, his bare feet silent on the polished marble. He had been ordered to serve, to remain invisible, unless a cup ran dry or a plate needed clearing. Then he was to move swiftly without error. Demetrius held court at the center of the gathering, his voice smooth as he expounded on the nature of justice. A virtuous man, he declared, is one who governs his passions, who acts in accordance with reason and the good of the polis. The guests nodded, their expressions rapt, as if the words were divine revelation. Lysander's fingers tightened around the pitcher. He had heard these speeches before, had scrubbed the floors where these same men spat and dropped their refuse. He knew the truth that lay beneath the polished words. A slave beside him, an older man with a stooped back, misjudged the angle of his pour. A drop of wine splashed onto the hem of a guest's robe. The reaction was immediate. A sharp backhand sent the slave stumbling, the pitcher clattering to the ground. The room barely paused. The guest wiped his hand on a napkin, his face twisted in disgust, then turned back to the conversation as if nothing had happened. Demetrius did not even glance at the slave, now scrambling to collect the shattered pieces. Instead, he raised his own cup, his voice never faltering. True justice, he continued, is the harmony between the soul and the state. A man who cannot master himself is no better than a beast. Lysander's jaw clenched. The hypocrisy was a living thing, coiled in the room like smoke. These men spoke of reason, of virtue, yet their hands were quick to strike, their eyes blind to the suffering that sustained them. He refilled cups mechanically, his mind churning. The slave who had been struck now knelt in the corner, pressing a cloth to his split lip. No one looked at him. No one cared. Later, when the guests had departed and the house had settled into a drunken silence, Lysander scrubbed the wine stains from a floor. The scent of spilled drink and burnt oil clung to the air, mixing with the lingering echoes of lofty words. Elpis found him there, her hands full of discarded platters. She took one look at his face and sighed. "You're learning," she murmured, her voice low. "Justice is a story they tell themselves to sleep at night." Lysander stared at the water in his basin, murky with the remnants of the feast. He thought of his father's bowed head, of Theron's warnings, of the way Demetrius's voice had dripped with conviction even as his household bled under his rule. Was there justice for people like him? Or was the world simply a stage where the powerful played at virtue while the weak paid the price? The water rippled as he wrung out the cloth, his reflection breaking apart in the swirl. He did not have an answer, but the question, once planted, would not fade. The overseer's voice cracked like a whip through the stifling kitchen air. Lysander's hands stilled over the pile of grain he had been sifting, his spine rigid with instinctive dread. The man's shadow loomed in the doorway, his belt heavy with the promise of punishment. "You," the overseer barked, pointing at Lysander with a thick finger. "The mines need bodies. You're to report at dawn." The word struck like a physical blow. The mines, where men vanished into darkness, their lungs filling with dust until they coughed blood and collapsed, where the sun never reached, and the overseer's lashes fell without mercy. A death sentence, spoken so casually it might as well have been an order to fetch water. Lysander's breath came too fast. He had seen the men who returned from the mines, those who did return hollow-eyed, skeletal, their hands shaking from exhaustion. He had heard the whispers of those who didn't. No, the word tore from his lips before he could stop it. The overseer's face darkened. He stepped closer, the reek of sour wine and sweat rolling off him. "What did you say?" Lysander swallowed. His pulse roared in his ears, but he couldn't unspoke the defiance. "I won't go." The first blow knocked him to his knees. The second split his lip. The third drove the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping on the stone floor. The overseer's boot connected with his ribs once, twice, until the world narrowed to white-hot pain and the taste of copper in his mouth. When it ended, Lysander lay curled on his side, his body a map of fresh agony. The overseer spat on him before turning away. "Dawn," he repeated, as if the beating had been a mere formality. Silence settled over the kitchen. The other slaves kept their heads down, their movements careful, their eyes averted. Only when the overseer's footsteps faded did someone dare approach. Elpis knelt beside him, her hands swift and sure as she pressed a damp cloth to his bleeding mouth. Her touch was firm, unsentimental, but her eyes burned with something fiercer than pity. She slipped a crust of bread into his hand, her fingers lingering for the barest moment. "Eat," she murmured. "You'll need your strength." Lysander's fingers trembled around the bread. He wanted to speak, to ask how strength could possibly matter now, but his throat was too tight with unshed tears. Elpis leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear. "Remember what Theron told you," she whispered. "What's here?" Her fingertip brushed his temple. "They can't take that. Not unless you let them." Then the moment shattered. The overseer's voice bellowed from a courtyard, demanding Elpis's presence. She straightened, her face smoothing into blank obedience, but not before Lysander saw the fire in her gaze, a spark of rebellion, small but unbroken. As she hurried away, Lysander clutched the bread to his chest. The pain in his body was nothing compared to the dread coiling in his gut. Dawn would come too soon. The mines awaited. But as he lay there, tasting blood and defiance in equal measure, one thought crystallized in his mind. He would not go quietly. Let them drag him into the dark. Let them break his body. But he would not let them take what Elpis and Theron had fought to preserve in him. Not without a fight. The mines swallowed men whole. Lysander learned this truth on his first descent, the narrow tunnel yawning before him like the throat of some ancient beast. The air was thick with dust and the acrid tang of sweat, the feeble light of the overseer's torches casting long, flickering shadows against the jagged rock. The deeper they went, the heavier the darkness pressed in, until it felt less like walking and more like drowning. The work was ceaseless. Bent double, Lysander hacked at the stone with a rusted pick, his muscles screaming with each swing. The other slaves moved like ghosts around him, their faces hollow, their eyes vacant. No one spoke. Words were a waste of precious breath in this place, where even the act of breathing felt like inhaling shards of glass. At night, if it could be called night when no sun ever reached them, the slaves collapsed where they stood, their bodies curled on the damp rock like discarded tools. Lysander's hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over, the pain a constant companion. Hunger gnawed at his ribs, the meager rations barely enough to keep him standing. But worse than the labor was the silence. The mines were a tomb of unspoken suffering, where men died by inches and no one mourned. Lysander clung to memories like lifelines, his mother's voice, the scent of barley fields after rain, the weight of the wooden horse against his skin. He thought of Theron's warnings, of Elpis's defiance, anything to keep his mind from unraveling in the dark. Then one day he found the dying man. The slave lay slumped against the tunnel wall, his breath rattling in his chest, his fingers clutching at the rock as if it might anchor him to the world. Lysander hesitated, then knelt beside him, though he knew there was nothing to be done. The man's skin was gray, his lips cracked and bloodied, his ribs stark beneath his tattered tunic. For a moment, the man's gaze sharpened, locking onto Lysander with startling intensity. His hand, trembling, reached out, fingers brushing Lysander's wrist with surprising strength. "They build their greatness on our bones," he whispered, each word a labor. His eyes, glassy with pain, held something Lysander couldn't name. Not anger, not sorrow, but a terrible clarity. Then the light in them faded. His hand fell slack. Lysander sat frozen, the words echoing in his skull like a curse. Around him, the mines groaned on indifferent. No overseer came to drag the body away. It would be left to rot where it lay. Another nameless casualty of Athens' hunger for silver and stone. In that moment, Lysander understood. This was his fate. Not the grand death of a hero, not the quiet passing of a farmer in his bed, but this: to toil in darkness until his body gave out, to be forgotten before his bones even cooled. The realization should have crushed him. Instead, it settled over him like a shroud. Heavy, but familiar. He had fought, he had resisted, but the mines did not care. They would grind him down as they had ground down countless others, leaving no trace behind. Rising on unsteady legs, Lysander picked up his pickaxe. The dead man's words lingered, a truth too bitter to swallow yet too sharp to ignore. Athens stood tall, because men like him knelt in the dark, and no one would ever know. The fever came like a thief in the night, stealing what little strength Lysander had left. His body burned even as the damp chill of the mines seeped into his bones, the heat of illness warring with the cold embrace of the earth. Each breath was a struggle, his lungs rattling as if filled with gravel. The overseers had long since stopped looking at him. Another wasted slave, another body soon to be dragged out and discarded. They left him in a corner where the tunnel widened slightly, a hollow space where the sick and dying were dumped to spare the others the sight of their suffering. Lysander curled into himself, his fingers twitching against the rough stone floor. The wooden horse, tucked beneath his tunic for all these years, pressed against his ribs like a forgotten promise. In the haze of delirium, his mind wandered. He saw his mother's face, her hands rough from work, but gentle as they brushed his hair. He smelled the earth after rain, felt the warmth of the sun on his back as he ran through the fields. The wooden horse had been his then, a simple thing carved by his father's hands, its edges smoothed by countless hours of play. He had clutched at the day they took him, a talisman against the unknown. Now it was all that remained of the boy he had once been. The visions shifted. Theron's voice, low and steady, warning him of the cruelty ahead. Elpis's fingers pressing the bread into his palm, her eyes alight with defiance. The dying slave's whisper, "They build their greatness on our bones." A cough racked Lysander's body, leaving his mouth tasting of iron. His vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in like the tide. Somewhere beyond the tunnels, Athens thrived. Its philosophers debated. Its merchants traded. Its citizens walked in sunlight, never knowing the cost of their comfort. Would anyone remember him? Would his mother still weep for the boy taken from her? Or had time dulled the pain? Would Elpis whisper his name in the kitchen? Or would he fade into the silence like all the others? The wooden horse slipped from his fingers as his hand went slack, landing soundlessly in the dust. His breath grew shallow, each one farther apart than the last. The darkness was no longer oppressive, it was soft, a relief from the weight of chains and the ache of broken bones. As his eyes fluttered shut, Lysander thought of the fields of his childhood, golden under the setting sun. He thought of the wooden horse, spinning in the dirt as he laughed. Then nothing. The mines did not pause. The overseers did not notice. The world went on unbroken, as another nameless slave was swallowed by the dark. Years unfurled like scrolls in the hands of time, their edges brittle with forgotten names. In the marble halls of Athens, Demetrius dipped his stylus into ink and set to work on his treatise, on justice and the soul. His words precise, his arguments polished. The parchment drank in his wisdom, each line a testament to his intellect, his virtue. He wrote of harmony, of the ideal state, of the noble pursuit of truth. Not once did his thoughts turn to the slaves who had ground his grain, poured his wine, or dug the silver that lined his pockets. Not once did he recall the boy with the wooden horse, the man who had coughed his last breath into the dust of the mines. The treatise was celebrated, copied, passed from hand to hand among the city's elite. Demetrius's name was spoken with reverence in the agora, his ideas shaping laws, his voice echoing through the halls of power. Athens, after all, was a city of philosophers, of enlightened minds. Never mind the blood in its mortar, the bones in its foundations. Far beneath the gleaming streets, in the labyrinth of tunnels where no sunlight ever reached, the mines stood silent. The air was thick with the ghosts of those who had labored there, their voices long since swallowed by the earth. The walls bore the marks of countless pickaxes, the floors the imprints of countless knees, and somewhere in the deepest dark lay a small wooden horse, its once smooth edges worn ragged by time. Above, Athens shone, a beacon of civilization, of reason, of progress. Below, the dead kept their secrets. Lysander's name was forgotten, but his story still echoes in every society that builds greatness on hidden suffering. The question is, when history looks back at us, will we be remembered as any different?